The ballroom glittered with $40 million of stolen luxury when agents sealed every exit. At the altar, Vanessa Whitmore clutched the hand of the lover she had financed with her husband's life insurance, certain Elias was buried, forgotten, and powerless. Then the wedding screens flickered. Elias appeared alive, wearing the suit from his funeral portrait, while an FBI accountant exposed forged death certificates, offshore transfers, and a murder plot disguised as an accident. As champagne glasses hit the floor, Vanessa realized the man she had declared dead had returned to reclaim more than money he had returned with proof. The story began on a private stretch of coastline in the Bahamas, where hundreds of wealthy guests gathered beneath white orchids flown in on a private jet for a wedding that would cost $40 million. The resort had been rented in its entirety. A 60-piece orchestra played beneath a floating stage, built out over the water, and screens taller than the palm trees, replayed a curated montage of love loss and rebirth starring Vanessa Whitmore and a real estate developer named Preston Maddox. Vanessa walked among her guests in a gown stitched with thousands of diamonds, smiling the smile of a woman who believed she had already won. None of the guests, raising their glasses, knew that most of what surrounded them had been purchased with money paid out on a dead man's life insurance policy. Less than 2 miles from the celebration, inside an armored vehicle, parked along a quiet access road, Elias Whitmore watched his own memorial turned wedding through a live security feed, his face unreadable, his hands folded in his lap. He asked only one question of the federal accountant seated beside him, a woman named Loretta Shaw, who had spent months untangling the money. He wanted to know how much his wife had spent. Loretta told him the government had already traced $12 million in fraudulent insurance proceeds and another $28 million siphoned from his companies through forged loans and shell corporations, a total nearing $40 million that had built the very spectacle glowing on the screen in front of him. Special Agent Marcellus Grant, seated across from Elias, confirmed that the arrest warrants were signed and the teams were in position ready to move the moment Elias gave the word. But Elias asked them to wait. He wanted Vanessa to stand in front of every camera and every guest and announce in her own voice the source of the money and the transfer of the properties to Preston. He wanted no lawyer to later claim she had been confused, coerced, or unaware of what she was doing. He thought of the woman who had once promised to stay beside him until death, and of the insurance policy she had convinced him to sign 3 years earlier, under the guise of protecting his charity and his company. 11 months ago, she had tried to turn that signature into cash. As the wedding planner announced that Vanessa was preparing to reveal a special gift for her new husband, valued at $40 million, Elias straightened his jacket and told Marcellus he was ready, adding quietly that he had been ready since the day they left him for dead at the bottom of a ravine. Marcellus had watched Elias build that composure over months of recovery, first in a hospital bed in Nassau and later in a windowless federal office where evidence boards slowly replaced hospital charts. He remembered the early days when Elias could barely stand without support, when the man who once analyzed billion-dollar portfolios could not hold a pen steady enough to sign his own name. Talia had warned the Bureau that pushing him too quickly could undo months of physical therapy. Yet, every night, Elias insisted on reviewing another folder of transaction records, another timestamp, another piece of the puzzle that would eventually prove his wife had orchestrated his death, rather than simply profited from it. Marcellus had seen grief before, had seen anger before, but he had never seen a man convert both into something as disciplined and patient as what Elias was building. It was that discipline more than anything that convinced the Bureau to let him help shape the strategy rather than simply serve as a witness. 18 months earlier, Elias and Vanessa had been considered one of the most admired couples among Atlanta's black business elite. Elias had built Whitmore Risk Analytics from a 2-room office into a firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars, specializing in uncovering the exact kind of fraud his wife would eventually commit. Vanessa represented the company at galas and charity dinners, praised in public for her grace and generosity, while privately she grew resentful of standing in her husband's shadow. She wanted a larger yacht, more television appearances, a famous mansion, flashier real estate deals, and a version of the Whitmore name that read as a luxury brand rather than a risk management firm. Elias refused most of these ventures, after discovering that several of the deals Vanessa pushed for connected back to businesses with murky ownership structures. Chief among them, a hospitality project belonging to Preston Maddox, a charismatic developer chasing $25 million to save a collapsing hotel portfolio. Vanessa insisted Preston had vision. Elias insisted Preston was using new investor money to paper over old debts, and he refused to be one of those investors. After a charity dinner one evening, Preston found Vanessa alone at the hotel bar and told her that her husband failed to see her value, that it was Vanessa who had built the public face of an empire, that Elias received all the credit. He did not ask her to leave her marriage immediately. Instead, he planted a slower idea, telling her that a divorce would only ever give her a fraction of what she deserved, but a husband who no longer existed would give her everything. What began as late business meetings became an affair, carried out in hotel suites paid for through Preston's shrinking line of credit, and later, once Vanessa grew bolder in properties, Elias himself had purchased for the company's use. She told herself it was harmless at first. A private rebellion against a husband who spent more time with spreadsheets than with her. But Preston was patient in a way that felt like devotion, always waiting exactly as long as he needed, before pushing her one step further than the step before. He praised her instincts, told her she understood luxury and image in ways Elias never would, and slowly convinced her that the empire bearing the Whitmore name existed because of her charm, not her husband's discipline. Vanessa's mind drifted back to the $12 million life insurance policy sitting in Elias's name, a policy she had once convinced him to purchase to protect the company and the foundation should anything happen to him, she was the primary beneficiary. Quietly over the following weeks, she began collecting his digital signatures, his medical records, his travel patterns, old passwords, copies of his identification, and details about the private trips he took for work. Preston told her they only needed an accident violent enough to leave no clear body behind. Vanessa recoiled at first, horrified by her own thoughts. But when Elias rejected Preston's $25 million proposal in front of the board of directors, her hurt curdled into something closer to hatred, and standing in front of the safe that held the Prestons' policy, she called Preston, and told him she no longer wanted a divorce. When he asked what she wanted instead, she said simply that she wanted to become a widow. Preston arranged for a transportation manager who owed him money to tamper with the brakes of Elias's SUV before a planned drive to a research facility in the Georgia mountains. A truck would force him off the road, sending the vehicle down into a ravine. Vanessa supplied the exact schedule and even convinced Elias to drive alone, telling him the quiet time would help him think about their marriage. Before he left, she held him longer than usual and told him that whatever happened, she would always love him. Elias had already sensed something was wrong. For weeks he had noticed unusual transfers from the charity's accounts and had found a recently opened copy of a life insurance policy tucked inside the safe. Because uncovering fraud was his profession, he quietly backed up data through a device hidden in his watch and activated a recording system inside the vehicle, though he still believed his wife was hiding a failed investment rather than plotting his death. The morning of the drive, Elias noticed nothing unusual beyond the faint hesitation in the pedal as he pulled out of the driveway, a hesitation he attributed to the cold rather than to sabotage. He drove alone through winding roads lined with pine trees, replaying in his mind the strange tension that had settled over his marriage. In recent weeks, unaware that every mile he traveled was being tracked from a phone sitting on his own kitchen counter. On the mountain road, the brakes failed exactly as planned, and a black truck pressed in from behind, forcing the SUV through the guardrail and down into a rain-swollen river. The driver climbed down to check, watched the current, pull the wreckage away, and reported back to Preston that Elias could not have survived. In reality, Elias had escaped through a shattered window, badly injured, and losing blood swept deep into a remote forested stretch downstream. A private relief crew found him unconscious, and because his identification had washed away in the current, they airlifted him to a recovery facility in Nassau. Vanessa appeared before cameras at the crash site, weeping and demanding the search continue, while privately pressuring local officials to declare Elias dead after a torn piece of jacket and his wedding ring planted downstream by Preston were recovered. There was no body, Attorney Gideon Brooks warned that a legal declaration of death could take years, so Vanessa produced a death certificate signed by a local official and an identification report that was later revealed to be entirely fabricated. The insurance company delayed the payout, flagging irregularities in the file. Furious, Vanessa listened as Preston reassured her that they had already arranged a doctor and two false witnesses to confirm Elias had died during emergency transport. When a claims adjuster demanded further evidence, Vanessa quietly funneled $300,000 through the charitable foundation to bribe a senior manager inside the insurance company. 6 weeks later, the $12 million payout was released. Vanessa received the transfer notification while lying beside Preston in the bedroom that had once belonged only to Elias, turning the screen toward him with a satisfied smile as he kissed her and told her they could finally begin a new life. In Nassau, at that exact moment, Elias opened his eyes. He woke nearly 2 months later from a coma, his body broken, his nerves, damaged, part of his memory of the crash, gone entirely. Dr. Talia Monroe, who had overseen his recovery, told him no one had been able to identify him, though the storage chip hidden inside his damaged watch had survived intact. When his name finally surfaced through the fog of memory, Talia searched for him online, and both of them stared in disbelief at headline after headline, announcing that Elias Whitmore had died. Vanessa had staged an elegant memorial service and promised in a tearful public statement to carry his legacy forward. Within days, new headlines followed, revealing that Vanessa was now dating Preston Maddox, a man she described as the person who had helped her survive her grief. Less than 5 months after her husband's supposed death, she announced their engagement, along with a hundreds of millions of dollar resort project run by Preston and funded, the press release claimed, by the Whitmore family estate. Elias understood then that the crash had not been an accident at all. Talia urged him to contact the embassy and the police immediately, but Elias knew that revealing himself too soon would give Vanessa and Preston time to destroy records, move money offshore, blame accomplices, or simply claim they had genuinely believed he was dead. He needed proof that the crash had been engineered and that his wife had known he might still be alive. Working with a technician Talia trusted, he recovered partial data from the watch, including a recorded phone call between Vanessa and Preston. Before the drive, the sound of the brakes failing, a partial license plate belonging to the truck. The voice of the driver at the scene, and location data showing the truck had trailed Elias for more than 30 miles. Most damning of all was a call synced from his own phone, in which Vanessa told Preston not to contact her again until they were certain no one would ever find him. Using an old secure channel, Elias sent an encrypted message to Marcellus Grant, a federal agent he had once worked alongside on a banking fraud case years earlier. Marcellus initially dismissed the message as a scam, until Elias referenced a classified detail from that earlier investigation that only the two of them would know. 2 days later, Marcellus flew to Nassau with a small team, and the moment he saw Elias standing alive in front of him, he understood this was no longer simply an insurance fraud case. It was attempted murder, laundering, forged federal documents, and cross-border financial manipulation, all wrapped into one conspiracy. The Bureau placed Elias into temporary protective custody, keeping his survival off every public record, while Elias agreed not to contact Vanessa directly. Marcellus told him that if the goal was only to punish theft, they could act that same day. But if the goal was to prove attempted murder, they needed to let Vanessa and Preston keep making mistakes. Watching Vanessa try on wedding gowns on a broadcast segment announcing a $40 million celebration, Elias switched off the screen and said quietly that they should let her spend every last dollar because afterward he intended to prove exactly where each one had come from. The $12 million insurance payout was only the beginning. Convinced her status as a widow gave her full authority over her husband's assets, Vanessa let Preston persuade her to bankroll his collapsing projects, funneling $6 million into an event production company, $8 million into resort acquisitions, $5 million as a deposit on a private jet, $4 million into jewelry, $3 million to quietly settle Preston's hidden debts, and millions more scattered across a web of shell corporations, until the total tied to the wedding crept toward $40 million. What she did not know was that true ownership of Whitmore Risk Analytics sat inside an irrevocable trust that could not be transferred without direct authorization from Gideon Brooks, and that most of the assets she believed she controlled were in fact loans secured against forged documents. Gideon pretended to cooperate, while quietly reporting every unusual request straight to the Bureau. Loretta Shaw traced the money and discovered the insurance proceeds had been split across 17 accounts before funding the wedding deposit. A pattern of structuring that added organized money laundering to the growing list of charges. An undercover agent placed inside the event planning company recorded Preston instructing staff to label every invoice as resort development expenses rather than wedding costs. Tension grew between Vanessa and Preston as he kept demanding more money, and she discovered he was still courting other investors, quietly preparing to disappear after the ceremony. Preston flipped the threat back on her, warning that if she pulled away, he would hand over every piece of evidence proving she had signed the false death certificate and collected the insurance herself. Vanessa realized she was no longer his partner, but his hostage. Meanwhile, recovering steadily under Talia's care, Elias began working directly with federal investigators, spotting transfer patterns Loretta had not yet connected. He discovered that Preston viewed the wedding as a final deadline, planning to move ownership of the resort into a foreign shell company and abandon Vanessa immediately afterward, leaving her to face the charges alone. What wounded Elias most was not the money, but a piece of footage recorded inside his old home office in which Vanessa told Preston that once they were married, nothing bearing the name Elias Whitmore would remain. When the Bureau asked whether he wanted Vanessa arrested immediately, Elias looked at the transfer document she was set to sign at the wedding, one that would formally hand over every asset she had stolen into shared ownership with Preston. He told them to let her sign it because he wanted her to prove in her own handwriting that this had never been grief. It had been a plan from the beginning. Working from the partial license plate recovered off the watch data, federal investigators traced the truck to a transportation company owned by a man named Roland Pierce, who had received several payments from Preston and vanished shortly after the crash. Marcellus eventually located him living under a false name in a small coastal town in Florida. Elias wanted to confront Roland directly, but Marcellus refused, calling it far too dangerous. Agents arrested Roland during a staged traffic stop, and he denied everything until Loretta produced records of a $750,000 payment from one of Preston's companies, which Roland dismissed as ordinary transport fees. Only when Marcellus showed him a photograph of Elias very much alive did Roland's composure break. He understood immediately that Preston could no longer protect him. For nearly an hour, Roland sat silent in the interrogation room, arms crossed, insisting he had done nothing more than deliver a truck to a job site as instructed, until Marcellus laid out photographs of the crash site alongside bank statements showing the exact date his mysterious payment cleared. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Loretta began to think he might hold out entirely. But the moment Marcellus slid the photograph of Elias across the table, something in Roland's posture collapsed. He asked in a voice much smaller than before whether Elias was truly alive, and when Marcellus confirmed it, Roland understood that Preston's promises of protection had always been worthless. Roland confessed that Preston had hired him to sabotage the brake line trail. Elias, along the mountain road, force the vehicle off the cliff, plant the ring and the torn jacket downstream, and report Elias dead, staying silent until the insurance money cleared. He revealed that Vanessa herself had called him directly after the crash, and that her only question had not been whether Elias suffered, but whether anyone could possibly have survived. Roland had recorded that call as insurance against Preston ever turning on him. Investigators traced the forged death certificate back to a private clinic, quietly funded through Vanessa's charitable foundation, and the physician who signed it agreed to cooperate once he understood the sentence he was facing, admitting that Vanessa had personally handed him $200,000, along with a pre-written report. Wiretaps caught Preston growing suspicious. After Roland disappeared, and he pressed Vanessa to cancel the wedding and move the money immediately, but she refused, unwilling to be humiliated in front of hundreds of prominent guests wrongly, believing that marital privilege would shield them both from testifying against each other. Preston never corrected her. He only needed her signature. Listening to the recorded call, in which Vanessa asked whether anyone could have survived, Elias let go of the last hope he had quietly held, that Preston alone had orchestrated the plot, and that Vanessa had only turned to fraud after believing him truly dead. That recording proved she had known from the very beginning that the crash was an attempt on his life. Talia reminded him that the truth would not erase the pain, but it would stop him from blaming himself for missing the warning signs. Elias resolved that when he finally faced Vanessa, he would not ask why she had done it. Every signature, every transfer, and every lie had already answered that question for him. With federal warrants signed for Vanessa Preston and 6 additional accomplices, Marcellus asked Elias whether he wanted the arrest to happen at the airport or before the ceremony began. Elias reviewed the schedule and saw that Vanessa planned to announce the $40 million gift right before the exchange of rings. He told Marcellus to let her announce it to the entire world first. On the wedding day, private security sealed the resort completely, and Vanessa required every guest to surrender their phones under the pretense of protecting exclusive footage, a decision the Bureau used to their advantage in isolating the Prout. Location. Federal agents posed as waitstaff lighting technicians, musicians, security personnel, flight crew, and even a banking representative, overseeing the final transfers, while Marcellus positioned teams at the docks, the airstrip, and every possible exit. Vanessa spent the morning of the wedding entirely unaware that the resort she believed she controlled had already become a stage, managed down to the smallest detail by federal agents. She complained to her planner that the lighting technician seemed unfamiliar with the equipment, never suspecting he was cataloging camera angles for surveillance rather than for the wedding album, and she waved off a brief power flicker during the sound check as nothing more than an old generator struggling under the weight of the elaborate staging. Preston, distracted by his own private calculations about how quickly he could leave the island once the ceremony ended, paid even less attention, brushing past agents, disguised as valets without a second glance. Before the ceremony, Gideon Brooks appeared as the attorney finalizing the transfer of assets, and believing she had bought his loyalty with a $2 million fee, Vanessa signed documents on camera confirming that the wedding assets belonged to her, that the funds originated from her late husband's insurance and estate, that she was willingly transferring control to Preston, that no one had coerced her, and that she fully understood every transaction involved. Each signature only strengthened the case being built against her. Behind the scenes, Preston quietly instructed the flight crew to be ready for departure immediately after the ceremony, having already moved a portion of the assets into an account only he controlled. When Vanessa discovered his luggage had already been loaded onto the plane, the two argued bitterly in the dressing suite, Preston insisting he was simply managing risk, Vanessa warning that if he abandoned her, she would expose the entire murder plot herself, unaware that the film crew's microphones were still recording every word. The ceremony began regardless, and Vanessa took the stage to deliver a tearful, fabricated account of finding love again, after tragedy insisting that Elias would have wanted her happiness. She then unveiled the promised wedding gift, a bundle that included the resort and the private jet, a portfolio of real estate, an investment fund, and tens of millions of dollars across various accounts. A total the MC proudly announced at $40 million. Guests applauded. Preston embraced her while his eyes drifted toward the runway. At that moment, Loretta transmitted the completed case file to a federal judge who signed an emergency order freezing every bank account, the resort, the jet, the yachts, the jewelry, the real estate, the shell companies, and every dollar connected to the wedding, ensuring not a single one could ever be transferred again. As the officiant called for the exchange of rings, the lights across the great hall suddenly went dark, and the automatic doors sealed shut. Vanessa assumed it was simply a dramatic surprise, until the screen behind the altar illuminated with the same portrait of Elias used at his memorial. A voice cut through the silence, telling her that she had organized a beautiful funeral. The image shifted to a live feed. Elias was standing just outside the hall. The main doors opened, and Elias stepped inside, wearing a suit that matched the one from his memorial portrait, flanked by Marcellus Loretta and dozens of federal agents. The music stopped completely. Somewhere in the crowd, a champagne glass shattered against the floor. Vanessa stumbled backward into the altar, while Preston scanned the room for any possible exit. Vanessa whispered that this could not be happening, and Elias replied quietly that this was exactly what she had paid to prevent. She tried to cast herself as the victim, insisting she had genuinely believed he was dead, rushing toward him, as though overcome with emotion. But two agents stepped between them before she could reach him. Marcellus announced that the resort and every related asset had been frozen under federal order. Loretta took control of the display system, replacing the wedding footage with a timeline of the entire conspiracy, showing the increase in the insurance policy. Vanessa's access to Elias's travel schedule, the payments to Roland the 40 Unclies, sabotage of the brakes, the forged death certificate, the bribed witness, the insurance proceeds split across 17 accounts, the funds funneled into the wedding, Preston's attempt to move money offshore, and the very documents Vanessa had signed, moments earlier confirming ownership. Then came the recording, Vanessa's own voice filling the hall, as she asked whether anyone could possibly have survived. No guest in that room still saw her as a grieving widow. Preston shoved a staff member aside and bolted toward the corridor, leading to the docks, unaware that every server in his path was an undercover agent, and he was restrained before he ever reached the water. He shouted that Vanessa had planned the entire scheme, and that he had only helped move the money while she fired back. That he had hired the driver and chosen the crash site. The two of them tearing each other apart in front of hundreds of witnesses and a room full of cameras. As Marcellus calmly let them talk, Vanessa turned to Elias and claimed she had made a mistake because she felt abandoned by him, and when she blamed Preston for manipulating her, Elias asked whether Preston had held her hand while she signed the false death certificate and whether he had forced her into a gown paid for with the proceeds of her husband's supposed death. She had no answer for either question. Gideon then revealed that Vanessa had never actually owned the company, or most of the assets she had pledged as collateral, and that under the terms of the trust control reverted automatically to Elias the moment he proved he was alive. Every loan she had taken out using forged documents was now under investigation, and the gown, the rings, the resort, and the jet were all classified as assets connected to criminal activity. When Vanessa asked what she had left, Loretta told her that even the dress she was wearing had been paid for from a now frozen account. Marcellus read the initial charges aloud: attempted murder insurance, fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, forgery, obstruction of justice, identity theft, and illegal cross-border transfers, before agents placed Preston in handcuffs and turned toward Vanessa. She looked at Elias one last time and asked if he had come only to humiliate her. He told her he had come to stop her from burying him a second time. In the hours immediately following the arrests, the resort emptied in a slow, stunned procession of guests who had come to celebrate a love story and left as witnesses to a federal takedown. Waitstaff, who had spent the evening pouring champagne, now stood guard over sealed rooms filled with financial records, while the orchestra's instruments sat abandoned on a stage no one would ever use again. Reporters who had been kept outside the resort's private security perimeter scrambled for any fragment of footage, and within a day, the story had traveled far beyond Atlanta, reaching newsrooms across the country and eventually overseas, where commentators debated how a woman so carefully constructed in public could have hidden something so monstrous in private. News of the arrest spread across the world within hours, and the footage of Elias walking into his own wedding became the center of endless coverage, though he refused every interview request, unwilling to turn his wife's betrayal into entertainment. The federal agents seized 17 bank accounts, 3 properties, a private jet, 2 yachts, millions of dollars in jewelry, Preston's electronic records, and the entire financial history of the charitable foundation. In custody, Vanessa believed she could negotiate by placing full blame on Preston. But he had already offered his cooperation, first handing investigators, messages, emails, and recordings, proving that Vanessa had not only known about the plan, but had suggested the timing of the crash herself. In retaliation, Vanessa revealed several other real estate schemes Preston had run in the past, and the two of them dragged each other deeper into new charges with every accusation. At a hearing over her frozen assets, Vanessa's attorney requested a release of funds to cover her legal defense. But Loretta demonstrated that nearly all of her money traced back to stolen insurance proceeds, illegally transferred, corporate assets, loans secured with forged documents or funds, taken from investors Preston had defrauded. The judge denied the request and stripped Vanessa of any remaining inheritance rights, citing her direct role in orchestrating the very death that would have entitled her to that inheritance. Rowland testified that Vanessa had asked whether Elias could possibly have survived the physician who signed the false certificate, confirmed his own testimony, and Talia produced medical records, proving Elias was alive at the exact moment. Vanessa swore under oath that she had seen proof of his death. In the end, the watch data and the recorded phone call dismantled every remaining line of defense. The trial itself stretched across several weeks, filling the courthouse gallery each morning with reporters, curious spectators, and former friends of the couple who once toasted their marriage at charity dinners and now sat quietly taking notes for magazine profiles. Prosecutors built their case, methodically walking the jury through bank records, phone logs, and the forensic accounting Loretta had assembled over months, careful never to let the sheer scale of the fraud overshadow the simpler, more damning truth at its center: that a wife had allowed her husband to be declared dead, while knowing there was a real chance he had survived. Defense attorneys for both Vanessa and Preston attempted to shift blame onto each other in front of the jury, just as they had inside the resort on the night of the arrest, each side producing witnesses meant to paint the other as the true architect of the conspiracy. But the recorded phone call, asking whether anyone could have survived, proved impossible for either defense team to explain away. On the stand, Elias did not paint Vanessa as a monster. He described calmly and without embellishment the sensation of losing the brakes, the moment the vehicle broke through the guardrail, waking to discover he had been declared dead, watching his wife build a new life on his name, and hearing her ask in her own voice whether he could possibly have survived. He told the court that what she had taken from him was worth far more than $12 million. She had taken his identity, his voice, and his right to exist. When the jury returned after several days of deliberation, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the clerk's voice, reading the verdict, seemed to echo off the walls. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Preston shifted in his seat as though still calculating an exit that no longer existed. Preston received a lengthy sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and financial fraud. Vanessa was convicted on multiple federal counts, and her sentence proved harsher than expected once the court determined she had exploited her position as beneficiary to transform an attempted murder into personal profit. The judge ordered full restitution to the insurance company, compensation for the defrauded investors' forfeiture of every connected asset, and a permanent ban preventing Vanessa from ever managing a charity or financial institution again. After debts and restitution were settled, the remaining proceeds from the sale of the resort and the seized properties were placed into a new fund dedicated to investigating insurance fraud, named in honor of victims targeted by relatives seeking a payout from their deaths. Vanessa understood that the very symbol of her dream wedding now financed investigations into crimes identical to her own. Before she was led out of the courtroom, she told Elias that she had truly loved him once. He answered that perhaps she had loved the life he provided, but the moment she had to choose between that life and his own, she had chosen the money without hesitation. The months following the verdict were quieter than Elias expected, filled less with vindication than with the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life that had been declared over. He learned to sleep without waking at every unfamiliar sound, to walk into rooms that once belonged to his marriage without feeling the weight of every memory attached to them, and to answer questions about his recovery without letting strangers turn his survival into a spectacle. Whitmore Risk Analytics welcomed him back gradually, his senior staff treating him with a careful blend of relief and disbelief. as though still adjusting to the fact that the man they had mourned was now reviewing quarterly reports beside them. A year later, Elias returned to Atlanta, but never moved back into the mansion he once shared with Vanessa, selling it instead and settling into a smaller home, overlooking a quiet lake. He restructured part of Whitmore Risk Analytics into a division dedicated to helping insurance companies identify cases where a policyholder's life was being targeted for financial gain, turning his own nightmare into a system built to protect others. Talia remained a close friend, helping him understand that survival was not only physical recovery, but relearning how to trust again. And though rumors occasionally circulated that their friendship might become something more, both of them seemed content to let it grow slowly, without the urgency that had once defined and destroyed his marriage. Marcellus retired shortly after the case closed, keeping a photograph from the wedding night, showing Elias walking past a line of federal agents to confront the woman who had tried to erase him a photograph. He described not as an image of revenge, but as an image of a man reclaiming his own name. The letter arrived on a plain envelope with no return address, and Elias recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful looping script that once signed birthday cards and anniversary notes, now signing an apology from behind prison walls. He held it for a long moment before opening it, half expecting the paper itself to feel different, as though guilt might change its texture. From prison, Vanessa wrote Elias a long letter, apologizing, describing her loneliness, and insisting Preston had turned her into someone she no longer recognized. Elias read it once and never replied, understanding that Preston may have fed her greed, but no one had forced her to sign a false certificate to accept $12 million in stolen insurance money to share a bed with her lover in her husband's own home, to fund a wedding with the proceeds of his supposed death, or to ask whether he could possibly have survived. Forgiveness did not mean allowing her to rewrite what had actually happened. The center had taken nearly a year to build, converted from a defunct office complex on the outskirts of Atlanta into a facility staffed by forensic accountants, former insurance investigators, and analysts trained specifically to spot the ferns, warning signs Elias himself had once missed. He had insisted on being involved in every stage of its design, not out of a desire for control, but because he understood better than almost anyone alive exactly what those warning signs looked like from the inside. Elias attended the opening of the new Fraud Investigation Center, funded entirely by the frozen wedding assets. No plaque bore Vanessa's name, or Preston's, only a single line engraved into the wall stating that no amount of money was worth more than a human life. Loretta handed him the center's very first case report, showing that its data had already stopped another insurance fraud scheme before a second victim could be harmed. Elias realized that the money once meant to reward his disappearance was now protecting other people from meeting the same fate. He thought often of the version of himself that had climbed into the SUV that morning, a man who still believed his wife's silence was born of some private worry rather than a countdown to his own death, and he found that he no longer resented that man for his blindness. Trust, Elias had come to understand, was not foolishness. It was simply the price of loving someone fully, and the fact that Vanessa had exploited that price did not mean the willingness to pay it had been a mistake. Standing on the balcony afterward, looking out over the city, Elias knew he would never recover the marriage, the years, or the trust he had once given so completely. But he had recovered his identity, his company, his integrity, control over his own life, and the ability to turn betrayal into something that mattered. The city lights below reminded him faintly of the night he first proposed to Vanessa on a rooftop, not far from where he now stood. A memory he no longer flinched away from, but simply observed the way one might study an old photograph of a stranger. He removed the wedding ring recovered from the riverbed years earlier, returned to him after the trial, and instead of discarding it, placed it inside the case file as a permanent reminder that love was never proven through vows spoken in the second front of a crowd, but through the choices made when no one else was watching. In her cell, Vanessa watched a news segment describing the new center funded the anchor, explained by assets seized from the unfinished $40 million wedding. She switched off the screen. In Atlanta, Elias walked into a conference room where his staff rose to greet the founder the world had once believed was dead. He looked at them and said simply that it was time to get back to work because somewhere out there people still needed to be found before anyone dared to declare them gone.